Welcome, fellow seekers of wisdom, to another journey through the corridors of philosophical thought. Tonight, we travel back over 2 millennia to ancient Greece to explore the life and revolutionary ideas of one of history's most influential thinkers, Aristotle. Whether you're here to learn something new before drifting off to sleep, or simply to let the gentle flow of philosophical ideas wash over you, you've come to the right place. We'll spend the next hour walking through the remarkable life of the man who taught Alexander the Great, founded his own school of philosophy, and laid the groundwork for countless fields of human knowledge. So settle in comfortably, close your eyes if you wish, and let us begin this peaceful exploration of one of humanity's greatest minds. Take a deep breath, relax, and let the story of Aristotle unfold like a gentle stream of consciousness, carrying you through the landscapes of ancient wisdom. Our story begins in the year 384 BCE, in the small coastal town of Stagira, nestled in the region of Macedonia in northern Greece. Here, in this quiet settlement overlooking the Aegean Sea, a child was born who would fundamentally change how humans understand the world around them. His name was Aristotle, and from his very first breath, he was surrounded by an atmosphere of learning and curiosity. Aristotle's father, Nicomachus, was no ordinary man. He served as the personal physician to King Amyntas III of Macedonia, which meant that young Aristotle grew up in close proximity to the royal court. This connection would prove significant throughout his life, as it was through this relationship that he would later come to tutor the king's grandson, who would become known to history as Alexander the Great. Imagine, if you will, the young Aristotle wandering through the halls of the Macedonian court, observing the intricate workings of politics, medicine, and human nature. His father Nicomachus would have exposed him to the medical knowledge of the time, teaching him about anatomy, the function of organs, and the delicate balance of health and disease. This early exposure to systematic observation and analysis would become a cornerstone of Aristotle's later philosophical method. The influence of his father's profession cannot be overstated. Medicine in ancient Greece was not merely about treating illness. It was about understanding the body as a complex system, observing symptoms carefully, and drawing logical conclusions about causes and effects. These skills of careful observation, systematic thinking, and logical analysis became deeply embedded in Aristotle's approach to all knowledge. When Aristotle was still quite young, perhaps around 10 years old, both of his parents died. This tragedy left him orphaned, but he was taken in by Proxenus of Atarneus, who became his guardian. Proxenus ensured that the boy received an excellent education, recognizing the spark of intellectual brilliance that already burned within him. Growing up in Macedonia during this period meant witnessing a kingdom on the rise. Macedonia was expanding its influence, developing new military techniques, and beginning to cast its shadow over the Greek city-states to the south. This environment of growth, change, and political sophistication provided young Aristotle with a unique perspective on power, governance, and human organization that would later inform his political philosophy. The Macedonia of Aristotle's youth was a land of contrasts. It was Greek in culture and language, yet distinct from the city-states of Athens and Sparta. It was a kingdom rather than a democracy, ruled by strong monarchs who valued both military prowess and intellectual achievement. This blend of practical politics and scholarly pursuit created an ideal environment for a future philosopher who would bridge the gap between abstract thinking and real-world application. At the age of 17, in 367 BCE, Aristotle made a decision that would change not only his own life, but the entire course of Western philosophy. He left his homeland of Macedonia and traveled south to Athens, the intellectual heart of the Greek world, to study at Plato's academy. The journey from Stagira to Athens was more than just a physical voyage, it was a pilgrimage to the center of philosophical learning. Athens, in the 4th century BCE, was a city buzzing with intellectual activity. Philosophers, mathematicians, politicians, and artists all gathered in its streets and squares to debate the great questions of existence, knowledge, and virtue. Plato's academy, established around 387 BCE, was unlike anything that had existed before. It was not merely a school, but a community of scholars dedicated to the pursuit of truth through dialogue, mathematical study, and philosophical inquiry. The academy was located in a grove sacred to the hero Academus, outside the city walls of Athens, providing a peaceful environment for contemplation and learning. When the young Aristotle arrived at the academy's doors, he encountered a world of ideas that must have seemed both familiar and revolutionary. Familiar because his upbringing had prepared him for systematic thinking. Revolutionary because Plato's philosophy challenged conventional ways of understanding reality itself. Plato, already in his 60s when Aristotle arrived, had developed a sophisticated philosophical system centered around his famous theory of forms. According to this theory, the physical world we perceive through our senses is merely a shadow or reflection of a higher realm of perfect, eternal forms, the form of justice, the form of beauty, the form of goodness. These perfect archetypes existed in a transcendent realm, and everything in our material world was an imperfect copy of these eternal truths. For nearly 20 years, Aristotle immersed himself in this Platonic worldview. He was not merely a passive student, but an active participant in the academy's intellectual life. Ancient sources tell us that Plato referred to Aristotle as the mind of the school, recognizing his exceptional analytical abilities and his capacity for rigorous argumentation. During these years at the academy, Aristotle absorbed not only Plato's teachings, but also engaged with the broader intellectual tradition that Plato had inherited. He studied the pre-Socratic philosophers who had first asked questions about the fundamental nature of reality. He learned about Heraclitus, who taught that everything is in flux, that you cannot step into the same river twice. He encountered the ideas of Parmenides, who argued that true reality is unchanging and eternal. But perhaps most importantly, Aristotle learned the Socratic method of questioning. Socrates, Plato's teacher, had developed a technique of inquiry that involved asking probing questions to expose the contradictions and assumptions in people's thinking. This method, refined and systematized by Plato, became a powerful tool in Aristotle's intellectual arsenal. As the years passed, however, Aristotle began to develop his own philosophical perspective. While he deeply respected Plato and remained grateful for his teachings, he started to question some of the fundamental assumptions of Platonic philosophy. The young man from Macedonia, with his background in medicine and his practical orientation, began to wonder whether Plato's theory of forms really provided the best explanation for the world we actually experience. Aristotle's questioning was not rebellious, but genuinely philosophical. He approached Plato's ideas with the same rigor that Plato had taught him to apply to all beliefs. If the forms were truly separate from the material world, how could they explain or cause anything in that world? If mathematical objects existed in a perfect realm beyond our senses, how could mathematics be useful for understanding physics and astronomy? These questions would eventually lead Aristotle to develop his own philosophical system, one that took seriously both the reality of the physical world and the power of human reason to understand it. But that transformation lay in the future. For now, the young philosopher continued his studies, absorbing everything the academy had to offer while quietly developing the intellectual tools that would eventually revolutionize human thought. The academy was more than just a place of learning. It was a way of life. Students and teachers lived together in a community dedicated to the pursuit of wisdom. They shared meals, participated in religious ceremonies, and engaged in the kind of deep, sustained conversation that can only happen when people are truly committed to understanding the world and their place in it. In 347 BCE, when Aristotle was 37 years old, Plato died. This event marked a turning point not only in Aristotle's personal life, but in the history of philosophy itself. With the death of his great teacher, Aristotle found himself at a crossroads. The Academy chose Speusippus, Plato's nephew, as its new head rather than Aristotle, who many considered the most brilliant of Plato's students. Whether disappointed by this decision or simply ready to pursue his own philosophical path, Aristotle left Athens. His departure marked the end of one chapter in his intellectual journey and the beginning of another. He would not return to Athens for 12 years, and when he did, he would be a different man, no longer merely Plato's student, but a philosopher in his own right, with revolutionary ideas about the nature of reality and knowledge. Aristotle's first destination was Assos, a Greek city on the coast of Asia Minor, in what is now Turkey. He had been invited there by Hermias, the ruler of Assos, who was himself a former student of Plato's academy. Hermias was that rare figure in the ancient world, a philosopher king, someone who tried to apply philosophical principles to actual governance. In Assos, Aristotle established a branch of the academy and began to develop his own approach to philosophical teaching and research. Here, surrounded by a small community of like-minded scholars, he had the freedom to explore ideas that went beyond what he had learned in Athens. The coastal location of Assos, with its rich marine environment, may have sparked Aristotle's lifelong interest in biological research. It was in Assos that Aristotle began his systematic study of living things. He spent hours observing sea creatures in tidal pools, collecting specimens, and carefully noting their characteristics and behaviors. This hands-on approach to understanding nature marked a significant departure from the more abstract philosophical method he had learned at the academy. Where Plato had looked beyond the physical world to find truth in eternal forms, Aristotle began to find truth by looking more closely at the physical world itself. During his time in Assos, Aristotle also married Pythias, who was either the daughter or niece of Hermias. This marriage brought him personal happiness and further strengthened his ties to the small community of philosophers in Assos. Pythias shared her husband's intellectual interests and provided him with the emotional support that would sustain him through the challenging years ahead. After 3 years in Assos, political tensions forced Aristotle to move on. Hermias had been captured and executed by the Persians, who suspected him of plotting with Philip of Macedonia against Persian interests. The danger extended to Hermias's associates, including Aristotle, who prudently decided to leave Asia Minor.
In Athens, Aristotle established a branch of the academy and began to develop his own approach to philosophical teaching and research. Here, surrounded by a small community of like-minded scholars, he had the freedom to explore ideas that went beyond what he had learned in Athens. The coastal location of Assos, with its rich marine environment, may have sparked Aristotle's lifelong interest in biological research. It was in Assos that Aristotle began his systematic study of living things. He spent hours observing sea creatures in tidal pools, collecting specimens, and carefully noting their characteristics and behaviors. This hands-on approach to understanding nature marked a significant departure from the more abstract philosophical method he had learned at the academy, where Plato had looked beyond the physical world to find truth in eternal forms. Aristotle began to find truth by looking more closely at the physical world itself. During his time in Assos, Aristotle also married Pythias, who was either the daughter or niece of Hermias. This marriage brought him personal happiness and further strengthened his ties to the small community of philosophers in Assos. Pythias shared her husband's intellectual interests and provided him with the emotional support that would sustain him through the challenging years ahead. After 3 years in Assos, political tensions forced Aristotle to move on. Hermias had been captured and executed by the Persians, who suspected him of plotting with Philip of Macedonia against Persian interests. The danger extended to Hermias's associates, including Aristotle, who prudently decided to leave Asia Minor. Aristotle's next destination was the island of Lesbos, where he was invited by Theophrastus, another former student of the academy who would later become Aristotle's most devoted follower and successor. Lesbos provided an even richer environment for biological research than Assos had. The island's diverse ecosystems, mountains, forests, wetlands, and coastlines, offered countless opportunities for the systematic study of plant and animal life. On Lesbos, Aristotle's approach to natural philosophy truly came into its own. He developed methods of classification that would remain influential for over 2,000 years. He dissected animals to understand their internal structure, observed their behavior in natural settings, and began to formulate theories about the relationship between form and function in living things. But Aristotle's time on Lesbos was also a period of personal growth and philosophical development. Away from the intellectual atmosphere of Athens, he had the mental space to synthesize everything he had learned and to develop his own unique perspective on the fundamental questions of philosophy. He began to work out his critique of Plato's theory of forms and to develop alternative theories about the nature of substance, causation, and knowledge. The years of travel and research were preparing Aristotle for the next phase of his career. He was no longer simply a student of philosophy, but was becoming a philosopher in his own right, with his own methods, his own questions, and his own approaches to finding answers. The practical, empirical orientation that would characterize his mature philosophy was taking shape during these years of exile from Athens. These travels also broadened Aristotle's understanding of human culture and politics. He observed different forms of government, different social customs, and different ways of organizing human communities. This comparative perspective would later inform his political philosophy and his systematic analysis of different types of constitutions and forms of government. In 343 BCE, when Aristotle was 41 years old, he received an invitation that would forever link his name with one of history's most famous figures. King Philip of Macedonia asked him to return to his homeland to serve as tutor to the king's 13-year-old son, Alexander. This appointment would prove to be one of the most fascinating relationships in all of human history. The meeting of perhaps the greatest philosopher and certainly the greatest conqueror of the ancient world. The invitation was not entirely surprising. Aristotle's father had served as physician to Philip's father, creating a long-standing connection between the two families. Moreover, Aristotle's reputation as a brilliant philosopher and natural scientist had spread throughout the Greek world. Philip, who was himself an intelligent and cultured man, recognized that his ambitious son would need the finest possible education to prepare him for the great destiny that lay ahead. Alexander was already showing signs of the exceptional qualities that would make him legendary. He was physically brave, intellectually curious, and possessed of an almost supernatural charisma. But he was also headstrong, passionate, and given to fits of temper. Philip hoped that Aristotle's philosophical training might provide some balance to these more volatile aspects of his son's character. The tutoring took place primarily in Mysa, a quiet town in the Macedonian countryside, away from the distractions and political intrigues of the royal court. Here, in a setting that resembled a school more than a palace, one of history's most extraordinary educational relationships unfolded. For 3 years, from 343 to 340 BCE, the philosopher and the future conqueror engaged in daily discussions about every aspect of human knowledge and experience. What did Aristotle teach young Alexander? We can only imagine the content of their conversations, but we know something about Aristotle's educational philosophy and the subjects that interested him most. Certainly, Alexander would have been introduced to the great works of Greek literature, especially Homer's Iliad, which became Alexander's favorite book and which he carried with him on his campaigns. Aristotle would have used these epic poems not just as literature but as sources of moral and political wisdom. Logic and rhetoric would have been central to Alexander's education. Aristotle believed that clear thinking and persuasive speaking were essential skills for anyone who hoped to lead others. He would have taught Alexander how to construct valid arguments, how to identify logical fallacies, and how to present ideas in ways that would convince and inspire others. Political philosophy was surely another major component of the curriculum. Aristotle was deeply interested in questions of governance, justice, and the organization of human communities. He would have discussed with Alexander the different forms of government: monarchy, aristocracy, democracy, and their corrupt forms, tyranny, oligarchy, and mob rule. These discussions would have provided Alexander with a theoretical framework for understanding the diverse political systems he would encounter during his conquests. Natural philosophy, Aristotle's own special passion, would also have featured prominently. Alexander's later scientific interests, his patronage of exploration, his collection of botanical and zoological specimens during his campaigns, his support for geographical research, all suggest that Aristotle successfully communicated his own fascination with the natural world. But perhaps the most important thing Aristotle gave Alexander was a method of thinking, a systematic, analytical approach to understanding any problem or situation. Aristotle taught Alexander to look for causes, to classify phenomena, to distinguish between essential and accidental characteristics, and to think through the logical implications of any position or policy. The relationship between teacher and student was complex and multifaceted. Aristotle was not merely a hired instructor, but became something like a father figure to Alexander, whose own father was often absent on military campaigns. At the same time, Alexander was no ordinary student, but a royal prince, destined for great things, someone whose friendship and patronage could prove valuable to a philosopher's career. Alexander's later achievements suggest that Aristotle's teaching was remarkably successful. The young king who would conquer most of the known world was also a patron of learning, a founder of cities, and someone who showed genuine interest in the customs and knowledge of the peoples he encountered. The Library of Alexandria, one of the greatest centers of learning in the ancient world, was founded by Alexander and reflects the value he placed on knowledge and scholarship. Yet there were also tensions in the relationship. Aristotle's political philosophy emphasized the superiority of Greek culture and the natural inequality between Greeks and so-called barbarians. Alexander, on the other hand, would adopt a more cosmopolitan approach during his conquests, incorporating Persian and other foreign customs into his court and treating conquered peoples with relative respect. This difference in outlook may have contributed to a cooling of their relationship in later years. When Alexander turned 16 and began to take on adult responsibilities, the intensive tutoring relationship came to an end. But the influence continued. Throughout his conquests, Alexander maintained correspondence with his former teacher and sent him specimens and observations from the far reaches of his empire. For his part, Aristotle took pride in his famous student's achievements. Even when he disagreed with some of Alexander's policies, in 335 BCE, at the age of 49, Aristotle returned to Athens after an absence of 12 years. The city he found was different from the one he had left. Alexander was now king and was embarking on his great campaign of conquest in Asia. Athens had submitted to Macedonian hegemony, and there was a new political and intellectual climate in the city that had once been the Aristotle's return was made possible partly by the protection offered by Macedonian power, but also by his own reputation as one of the leading philosophers of his generation. He was no longer merely Plato's former student, but a thinker in his own right, with his own ideas and his own following. The academy still existed under the leadership of Xenocrates, but it was clear that Aristotle's philosophical development had taken him in directions that were incompatible with orthodox Platonism. Rather than try to rejoin the academy, Aristotle decided to establish his own school. He chose a site outside the city walls, in a grove sacred to Apollo Lycaeus, the wolf god. This location gave its name to Aristotle's school, the Lyceum. Like the academy, the Lyceum was more than just a place of instruction. It was a community of scholars dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge in all its forms. The physical layout of the Lyceum reflected Aristotle's educational philosophy. The school included not only lecture halls and study rooms, but also gardens for botanical research, collections of specimens for zoological study, maps for geographical instruction, and what may have been the world's first research library. Aristotle believed that learning should engage all the senses and should be based on careful observation of the real world. One of the most distinctive features of the Lyceum was the covered walkway, or peripotos, where Aristotle liked to walk while teaching. This practice gave rise to the term peripatetic as a description of Aristotle's philosophical school. The image of the philosopher walking while he taught became iconic, suggesting a dynamic, active approach to learning that contrasted with the more static, contemplative model associated with other schools. At the Lyceum, Aristotle developed the most comprehensive and systematic body of knowledge that had ever been assembled by a single mind. Working with his students and colleagues, he investigated virtually every field of human inquiry: logic, ethics, politics, rhetoric, poetry, biology, physics, astronomy, psychology, and metaphysics. Each area was approached with the same rigorous methodology: careful observation, systematic classification, logical analysis, and theoretical synthesis. The organization of the Lyceum reflected Aristotle's belief that knowledge was most effectively pursued as a collaborative enterprise. Students were not merely passive recipients of wisdom but active participants in research projects. They collected data, performed experiments, made observations, and contributed to the growing body of systematic knowledge that the school was accumulating. Aristotle's teaching method at the Lyceum was quite different from what he had experienced at the academy. While Plato had relied primarily on dialogue and dialectical questioning, Aristotle developed a more structured approach to instruction. He delivered formal lectures on specialized topics, often using written notes and carefully organized materials. These lectures formed the basis for the treatises that would eventually be collected and transmitted to later generations. The breadth of Aristotle's interests at the Lyceum was truly extraordinary. In biology, he and his students catalogued and classified hundreds of species of animals, developing a system of taxonomy that would remain influential until the time of Linnaeus in the 18th century. They performed dissections, studied embryonic development, and investigated the relationships between different forms of life. In political science, the Lyceum compiled studies of 158 different constitutions from Greek city-states and foreign nations. This massive comparative project provided the empirical foundation for Aristotle's theoretical work on politics and government. Only one of these constitutional studies survives, the Constitution of Athens, but it gives us a glimpse of the scope and thoroughness of the research being conducted at the school. The Lyceum also served as a kind of think tank, providing advice on practical questions of law, governance, and social policy. Aristotle's reputation for wisdom and his systematic approach to problem-solving made him a sought-after consultant on matters ranging from constitutional reform to urban planning, but perhaps the most important work being done at the Lyceum was the development of Aristotle's philosophical system. Here, surrounded by devoted students and provided with the resources necessary for sustained research, Aristotle worked out his mature positions on all the fundamental questions of philosophy: his critique of Plato's theory of forms, his analysis of substance and causation, his logic, his ethics, his political theory. All of these central contributions to Western thought were developed during his years at the Lyceum. The atmosphere at the school seems to have been one of intense intellectual excitement. Students came from all over the Greek world to study with Aristotle, and many of them went on to make important contributions to philosophy and science in their own right. Theophrastus, who would succeed Aristotle as head of the school, became the founder of systematic botany. Eudemus wrote important works on mathematics and astronomy. Aristoxenus developed theories of music that remained influential for centuries. During his years at the Lyceum, Aristotle developed what was arguably the most comprehensive and systematic philosophical framework in human history. His approach was fundamentally different from that of his predecessors, including his beloved teacher, Plato. Where earlier philosophers had often focused on single questions or had developed their ideas through dialogue and debate, Aristotle created an interconnected system of knowledge that attempted to account for every aspect of reality and human experience. At the foundation of Aristotle's system was his revolutionary approach to logic. He was the first philosopher to develop a formal system of reasoning, complete with rules for valid inference and methods for detecting logical errors. His syllogistic logic, the analysis of arguments composed of premises and conclusions, remained the standard approach to logical reasoning for over 2,000 years. Consider, for example, his famous syllogism, "All men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal." This simple structure reveals the power of Aristotle's logical method. By identifying the underlying pattern of reasoning, he made it possible to evaluate the validity of arguments independent of their specific content. This was an intellectual breakthrough of enormous significance, providing humanity with reliable tools for distinguishing good reasoning from bad. But Aristotle's logic was not merely an abstract exercise. He saw it as the foundation for all knowledge, the method by which we could move from observation to understanding. Logic was the tool that allowed us to organize our experiences, to identify patterns, and to develop theories that could explain and predict natural phenomena. Moving from logic to what he called first philosophy, what we now call metaphysics, Aristotle tackled the most fundamental questions about the nature of reality. His starting point was a criticism of his teacher Plato's theory of forms, while respecting Plato's insight that there must be something permanent and universal behind the changing world of appearances. Aristotle argued that we need not look to a separate realm of perfect forms to find this permanence. Instead, Aristotle developed his theory of substance. According to this theory, individual things, like this particular horse, this specific tree, this unique human being, are the primary realities. These substances have both matter and form, but unlike Plato's forms, the form exists within the substance itself, not in some separate realm. The form of a horse is not a perfect horse existing in a world beyond our senses. It is the organizing principle that makes this particular collection of matter into a horse rather than something else. This may seem like a subtle distinction, but it had profound implications. Aristotle's approach allowed him to take seriously both the reality of the physical world and the power of universal concepts. We can have genuine knowledge about horses in general because all individual horses share the same form, but this knowledge is knowledge about real things in the real world, not about abstract entities in a separate realm. Aristotle's analysis of causation was equally revolutionary. He identified 4 different types of causes that must be understood to fully explain any phenomenon. The material cause is what something is made of, the bronze of a statue, for example. The formal cause is the structure or pattern that organizes the material, the shape of the statue. The efficient cause is what brings something into being, the sculptor who makes the statue. And the final cause is the purpose or end toward which something is directed. The reason the statue was made. This fourfold analysis of causation allowed Aristotle to provide much richer explanations of natural phenomena than had been possible before. When we understand all 4 causes of something, we truly understand it. This approach was particularly powerful in biology, where Aristotle could explain the structure and behavior of living things in terms of their purposes and functions. In the realm of ethics, Aristotle developed what is still considered one of the most compelling approaches to moral philosophy. His Nicomachean Ethics, named after his son Nicomachean, begins with the observation that all human actions aim at some good. But what is the highest good, the ultimate goal of human life? Aristotle's answer was eudaimonia, a Greek word often translated as happiness, but perhaps better understood as flourishing or the good life. This is not happiness in the sense of a temporary feeling of pleasure, but rather a state of being in which a person is living up to their full potential as a human being. But what does it mean to flourish as a human being? Aristotle's answer was that we must develop and exercise the virtues, excellent character traits that enable us to live well. These virtues are not abstract rules, but are habits that we develop through practice. Courage, justice, generosity, honesty, these become part of our character through repeated actions, until acting virtuously becomes second nature. Aristotle's approach to virtue was notably practical and psychological. He recognized that most virtues represent a mean between extremes of excess and deficiency. Courage, for example, is the mean between cowardice, deficiency of courage, and recklessness of courage. This doctrine of the mean provided practical guidance for moral development while acknowledging the complexity of ethical decision-making. In political philosophy, Aristotle brought the same systematic approach to bear on questions of government and social organization. His politics begins with the famous observation that man is by nature a political animal. We are not complete as individuals, but can only flourish as members of political communities. This insight led Aristotle to analyze the various forms of government, monarchy, aristocracy, and constitutional government, along with their corrupt forms, tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy. His analysis was based on extensive empirical research into the actual constitutions of Greek city-states, making his political philosophy far more grounded in real-world observation than the more utopian approaches of some other philosophers. Throughout all of these areas of inquiry, Aristotle maintained a consistent methodological approach. He began with careful observation of phenomena, looked for patterns and regularities, developed theoretical explanations, and then tested these theories against further observations. This approach, which we might recognize as an early form of the scientific method, allowed him to make genuine advances in understanding across an enormous range of subjects. Perhaps nowhere is Aristotle's practical wisdom more evident than in his approach to ethics, particularly his famous doctrine of the mean. This teaching, which has influenced moral thinking for over 2 millennia, reflects Aristotle's deep understanding of human psychology and his commitment to developing ethical theories that could actually guide people in living better lives. The doctrine of the mean grows out of Aristotle's observation that moral virtues typically involve finding the right balance between extremes. Consider courage, one of the cardinal virtues in Greek culture. Aristotle noticed that courage is not simply the absence of fear, nor is it the reckless disregard of danger. Instead, courage is the disposition to feel the appropriate amount of fear in dangerous situations and to act appropriately despite that fear. A person who feels no fear at all in genuinely dangerous situations might be called fearless, but Aristotle would say such a person is actually reckless or foolhardy. Their lack of appropriate fear prevents them from taking reasonable precautions and leads them to take unnecessary risks. On the other hand, a person who is paralyzed by fear in situations that require action is cowardly. They allow their fear to prevent them from doing what they should do. The courageous person feels fear when fear is appropriate, but is not controlled by that fear. They can assess situations accurately, take reasonable precautions, and act bravely when bravery is called for. This is what Aristotle means by the mean between extremes. Not a mathematical average, but the appropriate response to particular situations. This pattern applies to virtually all the virtues that Aristotle discusses. Generosity is the mean between stinginess and wasteful spending. A generous person gives the right amount, to the right people, at the right time, for the right reasons. Someone who never gives anything to anyone, even when they could easily afford to help, is stingy. But someone who gives away money indiscriminately, without regard for whether the recipients truly need help or will use it well, is not generous but wasteful. Honesty provides another clear example. The honest person tells the truth when truth-telling is appropriate and remains silent when speech would be harmful or inappropriate. The person who never tells the truth is a liar, but the person who always says exactly what they think, regardless of circumstances, is not honest but tactless or even cruel. What makes Aristotle's approach so psychologically sophisticated is his recognition that finding the mean is not a matter of following simple rules. The appropriate response to any situation depends on a complex array of factors: the particular circumstances, the people involved, the likely consequences of different actions, and the broader context in which the action takes place. This is why Aristotle emphasizes that virtue is a matter of practical wisdom or prudence. The intellectual virtue that allows us to deliberate well about human affairs. Practical wisdom involves the ability to perceive situations accurately, to understand the various goods and values that are at stake, and to choose actions that appropriately honor these goods and values. But how do we develop practical wisdom? Aristotle's answer is that it comes through experience and practice. We learn to be virtuous by acting virtuously, just as we learn to play a musical instrument by practicing. At first, our actions may be awkward and uncertain. We may make mistakes, choosing responses that are too extreme in one direction or another, but gradually, through repeated practice and careful attention to the results of our actions, we develop the kind of reliable character that naturally tends toward virtuous responses. This process of moral development is not automatic. It requires conscious effort, self-reflection, and often the guidance of wise mentors or friends. We need to pay attention to our emotions, our motivations, and the consequences of our actions. We need to cultivate the kind of self-knowledge that allows us to recognize our own tendencies toward particular extremes. Some people, for example, are naturally inclined toward excessive caution. They need to work on developing more boldness and willingness to take appropriate risks. Others are naturally impulsive and need to develop more careful deliberation and self-restraint. The path toward virtue is different for each person, depending on their natural temperament and the particular challenges they face. Aristotle's doctrine of the mean also helps explain why ethical behavior often seems so difficult. It would be much simpler if we could follow rigid rules, always tell the truth, never take risks, always give money to people who ask for it. But reality is more complex than simple rules can capture. The virtuous person must constantly make judgments about what response is appropriate to each new situation they encounter. This complexity is not a flaw in Aristotle's system, but a recognition of the genuine complexity of moral life. Ethical behavior requires not just good intentions, but also intelligence, experience, and the kind of practical wisdom that comes from years of thoughtful engagement with the challenges of human existence. The beauty of the doctrine of the mean is that it provides guidance without being rigid, and it acknowledges the difficulty of ethical life without being discouraging. It suggests that virtue is achievable through practice and effort, but it does not pretend that virtue is easy or that there are simple formulas for good living. The final chapter of Aristotle's life unfolded against a backdrop of political upheaval that would ultimately force him to leave Athens once again. In 323 BCE, news reached the Greek world that Alexander the Great had died suddenly in Babylon at the age of 32. This event sent shockwaves throughout the vast empire that Alexander had created, and its repercussions were felt even in the philosophical schools of Athens. Alexander's death triggered an immediate reaction against Macedonian influence throughout the Greek world. In Athens, the anti-Macedonian party, which had been suppressed during Alexander's lifetime, suddenly found its voice again. There was talk of rebellion, of throwing off the Macedonian yoke, and of restoring Athenian independence. In this charged atmosphere, anyone with connections to Macedonia became suspect. Aristotle found himself in an increasingly precarious position. His relationship with the Macedonian royal family, his years as Alexander's tutor, and his generally pro-Macedonian political stance made him a target for the resurgent anti-Macedonian sentiment. The situation became dangerous when he was formally charged with impiety, the same charge that had been brought against Socrates over 70 years earlier. The charge of impiety was often used in Athens as a political weapon against unpopular figures. In Aristotle's case, his accusers claimed that he had shown inappropriate reverence for his friend Hermias, the ruler of Assos, who had been executed by the Persians years earlier. Aristotle had written a hymn in honor of Hermias and had erected a statue to him, acts that his enemies now claimed were reserved for the gods. Faced with the prospect of a trial that would almost certainly result in his condemnation, Aristotle made a decision that revealed both his practical wisdom and his deep respect for philosophy itself. Rather than remain in Athens and face almost certain death, he chose to leave the city. According to later sources, he declared that he would not allow Athens to sin twice against philosophy, a reference to the city's earlier execution of Socrates. In 322 BCE, at the age of 62, Aristotle left Athens for the last time. He withdrew to Chalcis, a city on the island of Euboea, where his mother's family had property. This retreat to his maternal inheritance provided him with a safe haven from the political storms raging in Athens, but it also marked the end of his active teaching career and his leadership of the Lyceum. The transition was not easy for a man who had spent his entire adult life in the company of students and fellow philosophers. Chalcis was a quiet provincial town, far removed from the intellectual excitement of Athens. Here, separated from his books, his collections, and his research materials, Aristotle faced the prospect of spending his final years in relative isolation. Yet, even in exile, Aristotle's mind remained active. He spent his time organizing his thoughts, reviewing the vast body of work he had produced over the decades, and perhaps reflecting on the strange turns his life had taken. The boy from Macedonia who had come to Athens as a student had become one of the most influential thinkers in human history, only to end his days as a political refugee from the very city that had nurtured his intellectual development. Aristotle's health, which had never been robust, began to decline during his year in Chalcis. Ancient sources suggest that he suffered from stomach problems, possibly some form of digestive disorder that gradually weakened him. The stress of his political troubles, combined with the grief of losing his former student Alexander and the sadness of leaving his beloved school, may have accelerated his physical decline. In the autumn of 322 BCE, just 1 year after leaving Athens, Aristotle died in Chalcis at the age of 62. His death marked the end of an era in Greek philosophy, with Plato gone for 20 years and now Aristotle dead. The great age of classical Greek philosophy that had begun with Socrates was drawing to a close, but Aristotle's influence was far from over. Before leaving Athens, he had made arrangements for the continuation of his work. Theophrastus, his most devoted student, and closest collaborator, took over leadership of the Lyceum and continued the research programs that Aristotle had established. The school would remain active for centuries, preserving and developing the Aristotelian tradition. More importantly, Aristotle left behind an enormous body of written work. His treatises on logic, metaphysics, ethics, politics, biology, physics, and many other subjects represented the most comprehensive attempt ever made to systematize human knowledge. These works would be copied, studied, translated, and commented upon by countless generations of scholars, ensuring that Aristotle's ideas would continue to influence human thought long after his death. The man who had once walked the covered walkways of the Lyceum, surrounded by eager students and engaged in passionate discussions about the nature of reality, now rested quietly in a tomb in Chalcis. But his ideas lived on, carried forward by students and admirers who recognized that they had lost one of the greatest minds in human history. As we reach the end of our journey through Aristotle's life, it's worth reflecting on the extraordinary legacy he left behind. Few thinkers in human history have had such a profound and lasting impact on so many different areas of human knowledge and understanding, from logic to biology, from ethics to politics, from literary criticism to metaphysics. Aristotle's influence can be traced through more than 2 millennia of intellectual development. In the immediate aftermath of his death, Aristotle's works were preserved and continued by his students at the Lyceum. Theophrastus, who succeeded him as head of the school, extended Aristotle's biological research and became known as the father of botany. Other students carried forward his work in logic, ethics, and natural philosophy. For several centuries, the peripatetic school, as it came to be known, remained an important center of learning in the Greek world. But Aristotle's influence extended far beyond his immediate followers. When Alexander's empire fragmented after his death, Greek culture and learning spread throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. Aristotle's works were translated into various languages and studied by scholars in different cultural contexts. The Great Library of Alexandria, founded by Alexander's successors, became a center for the preservation and study of Aristotelian texts. During the Hellenistic period, Aristotle's logical works became particularly influential. His system of reasoning was refined and developed by later logicians, and it remained the standard approach to formal logic well into the modern era. Medieval scholars would later refer to Aristotle simply as the logician, recognizing his foundational contribution to this crucial area of human thought. When the Roman Empire absorbed Greek culture, Aristotle's works were translated into Latin and studied by Roman intellectuals. Cicero, one of Rome's greatest orators and political theorists, was deeply influenced by Aristotelian ideas about rhetoric, ethics, and politics. Through Roman intermediaries, Aristotelian concepts became embedded in Western legal and political traditions. Perhaps the most remarkable chapter in Aristotle's posthumous influence began in the medieval period, when his works were rediscovered and translated by Islamic scholars. Philosophers like Al-Farabi, Avicenna, and Averroes built upon Aristotelian foundations to develop sophisticated philosophical systems that synthesized Greek philosophy with Islamic theology. These Islamic philosophers preserved and extended Aristotelian thought during a period when much of it was lost in Western Europe. When Aristotle's works were retranslated from Arabic into Latin in the 12th and 13th centuries, they caused an intellectual revolution in medieval Europe. Scholars like Thomas Aquinas undertook the monumental task of reconciling Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology, creating the great synthesis known as scholasticism. For several centuries, Aristotle's authority was so great that he was known simply as the philosopher. The Renaissance brought new interest in Aristotelian texts and new approaches to interpreting them. Humanist scholars produced better editions of his works and developed more sophisticated understanding of their historical context. At the same time, the scientific revolution began to challenge some of Aristotle's specific claims about the natural world, leading to important developments in physics, astronomy, and biology. But even as modern science moved beyond Aristotelian physics, Aristotle's contributions to other areas remained influential. His logical system continued to be taught in universities until well into the 19th century. His political philosophy influenced the development of modern constitutional theory. His approach to ethics remained one of the major options in moral philosophy. In our own time, there has been a remarkable renaissance of interest in Aristotelian ideas. Contemporary virtue ethicists have rediscovered the power of Aristotle's approach to moral philosophy, finding in it resources for addressing problems that other ethical theories struggle to handle. Political philosophers continue to mine Aristotelian insights about the nature of political communities and the purposes of government. Even in fields that didn't exist in Aristotle's time, his influence can be felt. Cognitive scientists studying human reasoning have found that people naturally tend to think in ways that resemble Aristotelian logic. Biologists studying the organization of living systems have rediscovered the importance of functional explanation, the kind of teleological thinking that was central to Aristotle's approach to nature. What accounts for this enduring influence? Perhaps it is the systematic comprehensiveness of Aristotle's approach, his ability to see connections between different areas of inquiry and to develop unified frameworks for understanding diverse phenomena. Perhaps it is his practical orientation, his recognition that philosophy should help us live better lives and organize better societies. Perhaps it is simply the depth and rigor of his thinking, his ability to ask the right questions and to pursue them with extraordinary intellectual honesty and precision. As you drift toward sleep tonight, carried along by these gentle currents of philosophical reflection, you might consider what Aristotle would say about the activity of learning itself. He believed that all human beings naturally desire knowledge, that we are fulfilled when we understand the world around us and our place in it. The very fact that you are listening to these words, seeking to understand the life and thought of a philosopher who lived over 2,000 years ago, would have pleased him greatly. For Aristotle taught that wonder is the beginning of philosophy, and curiosity the engine of all genuine learning. In wondering about his life and ideas, in following the development of his thought from his student days in Athens to his final years in Chalcis, you are participating in the same activity that he valued above all others. The human quest for understanding. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with the kind of wonder that drives all genuine philosophical inquiry. The legacy of Aristotle, his systematic approach to knowledge, his practical wisdom, his recognition of the deep connections between how we think and how we live, continues to illuminate the path of human understanding, just as it has for more than 2 millennia. And in that continuing influence, the boy from Stagira, who became the tutor of kings and the teacher of generations, achieves a kind of immortality that he himself would have recognized and valued, the immortality of ideas that help us understand ourselves and our world more clearly, more deeply, and more wisely.